reporting. Cuba losing the last battle of the Cold War? From Washington, Brett Baer.
Fidel Castro and his brother Raul have ruled Cuba through 11 U.S. presidencies. They've often been a thorn in America's side. And now, in their waning years, as Cubans ponder life without the Castros, America has been reaching out to the regime.
We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
It was a bombshell. President Obama announced he would use his executive power to open diplomatic relations with Cuba and loosen restrictions on travel and trade. You're in favor of what the administration announced in December, opening up travel, trade, communication with Cuba. Why?
Because the policy of the last 54 years has been a complete and utter failure. The idea was that the embargo isolating Cuba would somehow bring down the Castro regime. The only people who have been isolated are the people of Cuba and U.S. policy in Latin America.
When what you're doing doesn't work for 50 years, it's time to try something new.
In his State of the Union speech, the president doubled down.
And this year, Congress should begin the work of ending the embargo.
Do you think it's the right move?
Why would you engage a rogue regime that has a history of abusing its people, anti-democratic to the core, and reward them with everything they want and get nothing in return?
Obama's overtures mark the biggest change in U.S.-Cuban relations since the embargo began more than a half-century ago. In that time, Cuba has occupied a unique place in the American imagination, an island neighbor that long ago and almost overnight became the enemy at our doorstep. Before Fidel Castro took over, the Caribbean nation was a favorite playground for Americans, a tropical paradise for those who could afford it. In the 1950s, Cuba itself was one of the richest nations in Latin America, but there was high unemployment. U.S. companies dominated its economy, and the U.S.-supported leader, Fulgencio Batista, ran a corrupt and repressive regime. The Castro-led revolution forced Batista into exile in 1959. At first, America didn't know what to make of this bearded man in military fatigues. The U.S., under President Eisenhower, recognized the new government, and some saw Castro as a hero. Indeed, Herbert Matthews in the New York Times lionized the young leader with lines like this, quote, "Dr. Fidel Castro is the greatest hero that their history has known." Castro himself didn't tip his hand.
We are not communists. Very clear.
But what soon became clear was America, in the middle of the Cold War, had a communist nation on its doorstep, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Castro took over farmland, nationalized businesses, including American companies, and signed deals with the Soviet government. Also, aided by Marxist revolutionary Che Guevara, he oversaw thousands of political executions. Before leaving office, President Dwight D. Eisenhower imposed a partial embargo on exports to Cuba. And in January 1961, the U.S. officially severed diplomatic relations with Cuba. Eisenhower also authorized a plan to overthrow Castro through a guerrilla force of Cuban exiles. That invasion at Cuba's Bay of Pigs in April 1961 was a fiasco, a propaganda coup for Castro. It was a black eye for the new president, John F. Kennedy. In 1962, Kennedy extended the Cuban embargo to all trade, with the exception of humanitarian aid, but not before purchasing 1,200 Cuban cigars for personal use. In October 1962 came the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States and the Soviet Union had a tense face-off over Soviet nuclear weapons deployed in Cuba. As part of the settlement, the U.S. agreed not to invade Cuba, but as punishment, President Kennedy imposed restrictions in 1963, preventing U.S. citizens from traveling there. Over the next few decades, presidential support for the embargo waxed and waned.
Supermarket. There is no fresh bread or meat on sale. Only jars and tins of goods from Red China and Russia.
But throughout the decades, this small communist nation was a constant thorn in the side of the U.S. Its defiance lent Cuba a certain romantic mystique in some circles. Hollywood celebrities spoke highly of Fidel, and progressives praised Cuba's socialized healthcare system. Liberal politician, now New York City Mayor, Bill de Blasio, traveled to Havana for his honeymoon in 1994. But no American president on the left or the right, from Eisenhower to George W. Bush, seriously altered the embargo policy. And then came President Obama, who promised to fundamentally transform America. Whether or not he succeeded is a judgment call, but there can be little question now he's fundamentally transformed our relations with Cuba.